Hello and welcome to the Geopolitics and Business Briefing, the series where we unpack major geopolitical developments and what they mean for global business, together with the experts who analyze them every day. I am Theresa Terzer, and today we are looking at a shift that sounds technical on the surface, but goes to the heart of Europe's economic security, the way the EU screens foreign direct investment, FDI. In late June this year, the EU adopted a revised FDI screening regulation. It will make screening mechanisms mandatory across all member states and broaden also the types of investment that can be reviewed. At first glance, this may sound like a compliance update, but it touches a bigger question: how far Europe is willing to go to protect critical sectors, strategic assets, and in the end, its own economic security. To help us understand what is changing and why it matters, I am joined by my colleague Sarah Isabey, a junior consultant at Geolytics who focuses on European economic security policy and geoeconomic trends across EU, US, and China relations. Sarah recently looked at exactly this development for our Geolytics hub, so she's the right person to walk us through it. Sarah, very warm welcome. It's great to have you in the briefing room.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Before we get into the update itself, can you briefly explain what FDI screening is and why governments use it?
Foreign direct investment screening is to be understood as a traditional trade defense measure. So what this means concretely is that governments are checking or reviewing foreign investment before those are completed. The aim of this is much less to restrict investment than to gather information and to ensure that it does not pose risks to security or to the public order. Before we dive into how the FDI screening mechanism was expanded in the EU, it makes sense to look into the core characteristics of the original regulation. And what's important to understand is that the ultimate mechanism is rooted in member states. So they are the one overseeing the investigation, the notification process to the Commission, requesting information from the companies, and especially taking the final decision over the investment. This final decision is review and investigation based, and upon an investigation, member states can then either authorize, condition, or fully restrict an investment. Nevertheless, over the more than 3,000 cases of FDI screening that took place under the FDI screening umbrella since 2019, only 1% were blocked in the end, which goes to show that this is more about screening and notifying than actively restricting investment.
And what has the EU now actually changed with the revised FDI screening regulation?
The revision of the regulation can be understood through four key major changes. The first one is that member states are now required to have an FDI screening mechanism and to comply with core requirements for the implementation of this mechanism. The first is that they have to go through a prescribed list of risk factors when they're reviewing investment. And they're more required to inform and to share this information with both the Commission and other member states, and they have a common deadline of 45 days to do their assessment. Second is that the regulation introduces a common minimum list of strategic sectors for which each member state is compelled to first proceed with an investigation before the investment is allowed. Under the strategic list of sectors fall, for instance, semiconductor, dual-use goods, quantum computing, critical infrastructure, and strategic raw materials. An important notice to understand here is that greenfield investment, fall outside of the mandatory scope for this specific section of the regulation. The two more elements to keep in mind about this regulation is that, third, the regulation introduces or closes an important loophole by extending the screening to investments that were made through EU subsidiaries and controlled by foreign investors. This means that EU companies that have a strong foreign foothold can now fall under a screening mechanism by a member state. Lastly, this new regulation also strengthens cooperation between member states and the European Commission with more harmonized procedures and expanded information sharing system. However, it's important to remember that the whole system remains rooted and under the jurisdiction of member states. Lastly, I'll point out that the regulation will start applying officially on the 17th of January 2028.
And can you explain, is there a special reason why the EU is tightening FDI screening now?
I think the rationale to reflect on this is to see it as both a reflection of practical experience and of an evolution of geopolitical realities. The first screening mechanism was implemented in 2019, and upon doing discussions and feedback sessions, the Commission identified that there were discrepancies between how member states were implementing and using the tool, with several member states not even having a screening mechanism up to 2026, some reviewing screenings very tightly and others very loosely. And parallelly to this, geopolitics have obviously evolved, with the EU being targeted by more and more risky investments, and those often coming through EU subsidiaries, which were not addressed by the original regulation, and the EU wanting to increasingly safeguard strategic technologies, which is why we now see with this new expansion the introduction of new sectors that are regarded as strategic and are guarded a bit more by this new screening investigation mechanism.
And why does the extension to EU subsidiaries controlled by third country investors matter now?
I believe previously some investors can potentially structure acquisitions through EU-based holdings or subsidiary, which made it way less clear whether an investment should be screened or not, and obviously just more risky. The revised regulation now makes a stark shift between looking at companies' headquarters and determining whether they fall or are considered European based on where they're based, and a new legal definition of a foreign-controlled entity, which means that even for a company with headquarters in Europe, if member states determine that they're ultimately directly or indirectly controlled by a foreign owner, they could still fall in the scope of the screening mechanism.
Understood. And what will this mean in practice for companies planning an investment in Europe?
First and foremost, I believe this means that FDI screening will become more part of a routine for investment planning. Transactions that will involve sensitive sectors are more likely to require this prior approval I was talking about earlier. What this means in concrete terms for companies is that they will be more subject to give information, additional documentation about the investment that they are planning. They have greater transparency requirements, and in some cases, this may lead to longer transaction timelines before the investments actually go through. For companies with complex international ownership, this may also shift how they are viewed, whether they're viewed as European or now foreign under this new regulation. And so these companies may find that more of their investment will now be subject to screening. That said, I think it's important to understand that this regulation is still a trade defense measure that targets investments that are risk to security and public order and not falling under an economic or commercial understanding or dynamic. And a second thing to understand for companies is that this regulation creates a floor, not a ceiling, which means that while member states are not all compelled to have a screening and to have core requirements, some states will still implement much starker screening and be more agile and assertive in how they're proceeding with these screenings. What this means in practice for companies is that there are still discrepancies between the different investment screening policies between member states. So after this regulation is implemented into national legislation, there may still be countries where it'll be easier to invest because there will be less screening, while in other countries they will fall under more scrutiny, even though all countries are part of the EU and fall under the EU screening mechanism.
And what is your advice? What should companies do now before the revised rules start applying in early 2028?
Well, the next 18 months provide companies with an opportunity to prepare. So first off, companies should review whether their activities fall within one of the strategic sectors covered by the revised framework, because in that case, it would mean that any investment with a product falling under the scope would definitely require, by any legislation in the EU, pre-acceptance before the investment can go through. Secondly, they should map their ownership and governance structure and reflect on whether they are regarded as a EU company or if this new regulation now regards them as foreign. Once more, this will most likely vary from one member state to the other, as the legislation foresees that the definition of what is regarded as a foreign controlled entity will be defined by individual member states. So it's important to continue mapping how each member states will interpret this new legislation into their national legislation. Third, and maybe more in the long run, businesses should integrate FDI screening more and more into how they're planning their investments into the EU, as since there will be more scrutiny, this may have an impact on how quickly and how feasible their investments are. I will also draw out that the new regulation foresees that once a company has been required to give information or has undergone an investigation for FDI screening, the member state authority may do ex post calls or requests for notifications up to 5 years after the initial investigation, which means that if an investment has already fallen under the scope of investigation, it's not exempt, even though the member states accepted the investment, and it may still be forced to give information up to 5 years after the investment. So that gets burdensome if a company is not well prepared to respond to these questions. I think my last and most important suggestion would be to look into how each member state will be implementing these policies and to map out how this will create differences in investment environments between each member states and which potential opportunities could arise for companies in countries where said regulation is implemented more loosely or more tighter, depending on business priorities.
Sarah, thank you so much for breaking this down for our listeners and me. To you, dear listeners, if you like to explore this topic further, you can find more analysis on it on our Geolytics Hub. I'll put all the information into the show notes. And if you have any feedback or suggestions for topics you want us to cover, feel free to reach out at podcast@geo-lytics.com. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time in the Geopolitics and Business Briefing Room.
Thank you.